Bulgarian researcher the New Earth Lady believes that when speaking about remains of ancient advanced civilizations in Africa, everybody thinks about Egypt only. But there is much more than that. A village in Ethiopia called Yaja, the ancient ruins that are found here show amazing building qualities. The sites of the stones, or the geopolymer blocks, are perfect, even smooth, and they are even polished. According to mainstream sources, these lands have always been inhabited by various very simple tribal cultures. But how come we find these buildings of very high quality in what really looks like an antique Greco-Roman style? The quality of this building work in this unknown village is much higher than that of the supreme emperors of Rome, whose main palaces, supposedly the centre of power, were made of mud bricks. While this structure is made of big blocks, some of them reaching into 2.5 meters in length, she states. Also, the building style of these megalithic structures, there are a few of them in Ethiopia, is very similar to these that are found in Yemen. These photos from Yemen are just a comparison, and by the way, the same building styles can be found in Temple Mount in Jerusalem, in Cambodia, Turkey and Peru. It is almost as if the same builder made them all, but this builder is not present at all in the current history of Ethiopia, she believes. Now look at this single stone, she states. It is a stone 20 meters long. That is gigantic, and it definitely rivals the highest quality of work found in the Egyptian megaliths. And this is the actual quarry from where the mainstream historians assured us that this stone was taken. Well, first of all, it's a completely different colour. It has reddish tones, but look at the megaliths. Some are a whitish colour, whilst others are darker. Not at all like the quarry, she points out. Actually, the entire so-called quarry consists of small staircases cut into the rock. Not to mention the enormous obelisks found in Aksum, a town in northern Ethiopia. They are much bigger than the famous Egyptian obelisks, and even with our advanced technology these days, we cannot rebuild them to the previous glory. Not in one piece anyway, as they originally did. We had to cut it into pieces. We can't do it all at once. And again, she points out, not only the weight of the obelisks, but also the technology that was used in cutting them is far beyond the reach of any primitive tools, no matter how many millions of slaves were labouring for the hundreds and thousands of years. These achievements are simply ignored by those who write the mainstream history, she believes. They do not mention them. Instead, they pretend that they don't exist and continue writing about mud huts in the past. The historians and cartographers were well aware that Ethiopia belonged to this culture that now we mistakenly call Greco-Roman. Here, in an old medieval map of Ethiopia, we see a king who, to us, may seem as if he's in the wrong place. But if we believe what we see in terms of ruins, instead of what the historians tell us, then everything falls into place. Another interesting point to consider is that the megaliths of Ethiopia are made of stone that is not available locally. The nearest place where such stone can be found is in Egypt, she states. When a group of Russian researchers visited the nearby quarries where the mainstream historians tell us and assure us that the stone was taken, they were surprised to find that the stone had nothing to do with the stone that is used in the actual megalithic sites. So it's either artificially made stone, which we call geopolymer, or it had been transported over thousands and thousands of kilometers from Egypt or somewhere else, which is of course not a problem for advanced technology. It is quite possible that they could have flown heavy cargoes anywhere in the world, she believes, but it would have been highly problematic for primitive tribes that supposedly lived in territory of Ethiopia. This is another interesting medieval map, she points out. Again, we see some sort of Caucasian ruler. The megaliths of Aksum are also very, very interesting, as they are a mixture of perfectly shaped megalithic blocks, hard stone, and very primitive old stonework. Also, almost, she speculates, as if two teams were working side by side, and that could have very well been the case. Do you see how the stones are mixed? It is not that the primitive was made on top of a better, older foundation seen in Peru, and it seems that the survivor builders were placing their megalithic polygonal blocks. This is similar to Peru, but this is Ethiopia. But it looks like Peru or Turkey or Japan, absolutely the same style. Here is a polygonal block. You won't find a gap between the stones. Huge sized blocks. So there are the survivors and then the rest. The rough, low quality work beside them is the work of simple tribal people that were building alongside. Or at least that's one of the possible scenarios. Another possibility is that initially, the full building was of high quality, and it got destroyed. Later on, the tribal people tried to repair it themselves, she speculates. Here, there is another parallel with the megaliths of Yemen. They basically look identical to those in Ethiopia. The building style, the blocks, the size, just the same, and we're back at Aksum, the very familiar megalithic underground tunnels. Enormous blocks of very high quality work. Everything is so polished. Even the sides that face other blocks are also polished to perfection. That's why there are no gaps. There's no mortar between the stones. And as usual, we see the survivor-style clamps, as seen everywhere else in the world, she states. Here, she points out, even the original metal has survived. The connection between the culture and, she calls, the nature people, or the survivors, and the ruins in Ethiopia is not confirmed just by the style, but also by the writing found in those ruins, she believes. We call them European ruins and Slavic ruins, but apparently they were not exclusive to that region. So again, the name given by the mainstream historians is not really suitable. Here, we are still in Ethiopia, and we see a very familiar symbol from the previous episodes. We saw it in the headwear and other symbols of the Japanese samurais, Lord Shiva in India, and on the flags of the native nations of South and North America. So of course it is all over the flags of medieval kingdoms in Europe. They all belong to the same culture. That's why the building style is the same, and the symbols are the same everywhere. And by the way, the village where the megalithic ruins are found is called Decher, probably for the same reason one of the Japanese islands was called Iso, she believes. Here are the famous rock between churches of the Lalibela, again in Ethiopia. The elders still tell the story that in the past angels of other races used to join the religious processions. And how were the churches made, she asks. That's a lot of work. By the way, people used to work during the day, and at night the angels used to continue the work. And it seems that these groups of angels weren't independent after all, because they cut the symbols of the survivors in the walls of the churches. According to the locals, the king during whose reign these churches were made used to travel in altered states of consciousness. And in these realms he was in touch with the angels under whose guidance the churches were made. The passages around them are quite deep, and at places some 15 meters wide. That's a large volume of stone, which is very unlikely to have been cut by local tribes, especially with the very short span of a couple of years during which the churches are considered to have been built. If we take the traditional story about the help of the angels, then the full story is much more believable, especially taking into account how fast that they were allegedly built. And as she found out very recently, Ethiopia is very rich in rock ruins that are in absolutely the same style as what we see in Turkey and Italy in great concentrations, and also in dozens of other countries. She believes their distribution covers most of Europe and Asia, and apparently now Africa. The same rock-cut rectangles which are typical for the early stages of rock cutting. All these are in Ethiopia. Then there are the Dionque style rock-cut cities. These cavities here are rooms. And then we find even the last wave of rock cutting also in Ethiopia are these arches like those of Turkey, Armenia, Italy and Spain. And as in all other regions, rock-cut ruins from the earlier periods were later on converted into monasteries and churches. Here in Turkey, you see only half of a room which is left. That is why they had to add patches, otherwise the rooms would be useless. The monks would have rolled down the cliff as they slept, for example. This is an example of rooms that have been patched, while this they did not get patched. Every word the same trick, she states. The mainstream historians pretend not to see that it is patched and persistently misrepresent the sites as being only Christian. Again, the patches are obvious. Here some of the rooms have been reduced to mere scars in the bedrock. If the whole thing was as recent as we're told, then where are the remains of the rest of the structure? Even if the structure was destroyed suddenly, then it would need such a long time to erode. There should still be remains in some form, but everything has been washed away or disappeared. The same can be seen on this Greek island. Massive rock ruins. Just look at the width and height of the street or canal, or possibly even premises, rooms deep underwater, well underwater. So what do they call these rooms, she asks. Caves? Which is greatly misleading because caves are natural formations. This large basin is just ignored. because these are classed as beaches, so apparently we can ignore them. But in one of the better preserved rock-cut rooms, somebody placed Christian paraphernalia, and now that is immediately recognised as a historic site and is immediately recognised as Christian. These are allowed to exist in their history. But now back to Ethiopia, where not only do we have the older so-called European ruins, which are actually worldwide ruins, but also later on during the era of Christianity, people used writing, very similar, if not identical, to what most people would call Cyrillic writing. Actually, people believe it or not, but in the Middle Ages, Ethiopia was repeatedly referred to as a place of St. John the Baptist. There could have been two possible reasons for this. First of all, because Ethiopia was a Christian country. Yes, here are just two of the numerous medieval quotes which you can find in the works of Anatoly Fomenko, who discovered Ethiopia as a place of monasteries and bishops. It also specifies the dark-skinned monks outnumbered the white-skinned. So probably there weren't that many pale-skinned anyway, she states. And the other reason for which Ethiopia was the place of St. John the Baptist could have been, believe it or not, but in the Middle Ages, Ethiopia was to be found primarily in Europe and in Africa as well. But it was a European phenomenon, she believes. In the medieval books, the name Ethiopia was very often always related to, let's say, Germany or Siberia, things like that. What we now call Ethiopia was previously called Abyssinia. Other names were also used. For instance, here it was called India. Here is the Ethiopian Ocean. Of course, thousands of kilometers away from Ethiopia. And this map is not an exception. This was the norm here as well. The Ethiopic Ocean, in modern language, was used to identify an area of the South Atlantic Ocean. So what was going on here, she asks? It was very important to understand what's going on in the relatively recent past. They changed almost all geographical names, and that was done with a specific and very clear intention in mind to make all texts and all maps, which by chance had escaped the parasitic destruction, unreadable, she believes, and not understandable for the people who could follow in the future. So that's how they took care of the written history. Let's now look at how they took care of the actual historical sites, she states. Let's visit the site located in the very capital of Ethiopia, Addis Ababa. Ironically, located just outside the city's main university in the area which is currently devoted to trash disposal, are the ruins of a very impressive medieval so-called European-style fortress that still sticks out here and there from the trash. At places, the walls are preserved even up to a height of about 4 meters, and the remains of many towers are still seen, and the full fortress has a very regular pentagonal shape, something which is typical for the so-called European star forts. The place is neglected to such an extent that she couldn't even discover its name. It was only through some travellers that she had learned about the ruins next to the University of Addis Ababa. She is not so sure they are being taught their own history. She suspects that they are preparing them for the next stage of the parasitic plans, where they don't even have mud huts anymore, and because they know that there are still some rational people left who will realize that this is seriously wrong, for them they have a different story. And they are giving them a small check, and in this way the good people have to become convinced that they have done everything possible, which is yet another illusion from the parasitic paradigm. She believes what we should do, actually, if we want to put an end to this nonsense of starvation, is first of all abolish central banking and get back to the honest monetary system. And once the packs of banksters no longer can create unlimited free money for themselves, then they won't be able to buy off entire countries, as they have done in Africa. And the earth will slowly recover from the dark ages of the bank's tourism, and people of different colour will again live like before, side by side, as equals, she believes. Excessive hoarding of money should be declared illegal. These artificial gaps in the society between rich and poor are only artificially created in order to keep us in constant fear and to instigate hatred, she states. We no longer need politicians who waste their time with small talk about reforms adjusting the conditions of slavery. We need politicians who will end the slavery to the banksters. So the people of Africa, as the people of all continents who are regularly visited and helped by human and non-human angels, she believes. For example, the story of the tribe of the Dogons is somewhat different. Their angels came from Sirius. Some researchers also found confirmation to this legend that the people of the tribe tell in terms of advanced astronomy, knowledge which the Dogons could not have obtained in any reasonable way, she states. Keeping in mind their relatively primitive lifestyle. There are some images of the indigenous original inhabitants of Africa. No, there's no confusion with the images. It's them. It's the Berbers. On one side, the mainstream historians don't deny that these are the original inhabitants of northern and even central Africa. And on the other hand, they assure us dark-skinned people live in Africa because they were fried under the sun for many thousands of years, and that is why they became black, she states. So how come some were getting fried and became black, while others, in the same furnace conditions, and remained rare and uncooked? The proper method for spotting and exposing liars has always been the same. As they continue to fabricate new and newer stories, the mountain peak of lies becomes so high that it's impossible anymore for any of the stories to match. Actually, as you saw in the previous episode about Australia, she believes the Berbers simply belong to the initial wave of survivors culture, as she calls it. The people who tattooed their faces. It's no surprise that we weren't being told the truth about their origin in northern Africa, because it was all the same in Australia, in Peru, and China, and Siberia. Burial sites in which mummies of Caucasian blonde people are found, but they never find the time to include them in any of the official history. The Berbers not only look Slavic, their writing is also similar to the runes used in Europe. The ancient African languages are basically part of the same worldwide rune-like writing system. and the mainstream historians are so busy finding the differences between the different types of runes and giving them all completely different names so that they look like a completely different writing system. They're so busy with that they fail to make the main observation, which is that on all continents, without exception, these writings are found. Not even one continent is without them. That they belong to a single culture, she believes. How is it that they are assuring us that everybody evolved independently and was discovered at some point by the colonists? But they were all using the same writing before the so-called discovery. Why is that, she asks. Historians assure us this is an African language from Sudan, which is 1,000 years old. And how come she doesn't know any African languages, yet she can read here words written in modern Slavic? No, she states, this is not some local language from Central Africa. This was a language used over continents. The patterns of the traditional Berber embroidery are identical to the patterns of Slavic people. This is a historic Berber site. The traditional outfits of the Berbers are very similar, if not absolutely identical, with the traditional outfits of those of some Slavic nations. What you see now are photos of traditional Slavic outfits. And if it was not for the caption of the photos, she could not even distinguish if they were Berbers or Slavs. Although she is of European descent herself, if she was shown a traditional costume, she couldn't say for sure if it was a Berber or Slavic, as they are identical. The costumes, and very often even the people who wear them, despite the obvious connection between the Berbers and the people of Europe, that even a small kid will notice in the mainstream history, they're built as absolutely independent. Credo Mudura is a very well known and respected person throughout Africa. He is a shaman and religious leader. He still remembers the old history that the native people had before the parasitic forces came and submitted it with lies in Africa. The same as in all the other continents. The locals were visited by angels, highly advanced beings who were tall, who taught them and educated them. The locals called them Mozulu. They contributed not only to making the locals more civilized, but they also contributed in a very practical manner to the local gene pool. That's why all over Africa, sometimes people with blue eyes and blonde hair get born. So as in all other continents, other demonic and angelic species left their genetic stamps. In Egypt, during pharaonic times, it wasn't different at all. It's obvious from the old depictions that all races lived along with each other. It's only in very modern times people became racists, brainwashed by the mass media. That's what they show us. They're politicians who talk about brotherhood, love and democracy, while actively, independently implementing programs and laws which create further inequalities in the societies, she states. The laws and programs that create gaps between the races and this very modern phenomena of racism is further nourished by shameless, fraudulent interpretations of history or straightforward fictional events, which they're telling us, like for example, the situation with slavery. Things were radically different from what they're telling us, but we will review slavery later on. What kind of people actually were buried in pharaonic times? Tutankhamun's DNA shows that he was a Caucasian person. We wonder how many of the other pharaohs were tested. Are any of the results published, she asks. But still, uncomfortable facts leaked out. And there, for example, in this cemetery with 1 million mummies, and very carefully near the end of the articles, the mainstream newspapers mentioned that many of the mummies inside were blonde or red-haired, and surprise, surprise, 213 centimeters tall. As far as we can understand, they actually closed the cemetery excavation, but some of the bodies were found to be some 30 meters below ground level. That is pretty deep for a burial. The burial is not that extremely old, as we can see from the stage of the preservation of the bodies, and yet how did this massive amount of 30 meters soil pile up around them? Now we reach the topic of the mysterious land masses and the sand masses in Egypt. A topic which doesn't get all the attention it deserves because it could prove pivotal in revealing the true history of ancient Egypt, as we call it. Actually, some parts of the story are not at all ancient, and the main points here are that there is evidence showing that the pharaonic times in the region of Egypt was actually a tropical habitat, very pleasant for habitation, she claims. On the other hand, we have evidence that it turned into a desert within a flash. While at the same time, if you open the official information on the Sahara, you will find all that the talk of the wind and the rivers grinding rocks into sand for millions and billions of years. The stories don't match at all. And on the other hand, the area around the Dead Sea, which is also part of the desert area, we also found evidence that it was tropical in relatively very recent past, and that it was burned, turned into desert by weapons, as discussed in the previous video about the timelines of the Earth that made her remember a mainstream history documentary that she saw a few years ago on a mainstream TV channel where archaeologists were excavating villages that were swallowed up by the desert in Egypt. The picture that their excavations revealed was pretty sad. People were lying around there, as if frozen in their daily activities, on the doorsteps of their homes, in the rooms, outside doing their daily activities. They were not buried. Rather, something happened in a flash in Egypt. They certainly didn't possess a tradition of leaving the bodies of their relatives to lay around in their houses. They used to bury them, mummify them. And the fact that they were left like this means that a disaster struck so quickly that there weren't any survivors even to bury the dead. As we delve further into this very interesting history, parts we are left pondering a very simple question. There's a whole lot of sand out there in the Sahara. How did it end up over there, moreover, in a flash, she asks. We're being assured by mainstream science that the Sahara formed absolutely naturally, and they're telling us that with such certainty as if they were first-hand witnesses when it was made, when in reality that idea is only a speculation, a non-confirmed hypothesis. On one hand, the origin of all sand which looks this smooth, of this colour, is very suspicious, and various scientists have been wondering and raising the question, is the sand in the desert as such of natural origin? Even its chemical composition doesn't match the same type of stone which allegedly was ground by gradual erosion to turn into the sand, she points out. Yes, there are some beaches with unusual black sand that really formed naturally, but these, the yellowish Sahara sand, has been raising suspicions. Many geologists have said that the sand really looks alien. Anyone who tries to discuss this point about how the Sahara appeared all of a sudden within a short geographical time period will be met with mainstream experts who go around the subject with vague things like the rivers must have carried it. Really, she states, what kind of river can carry this much sand? It would get clogged in no time. And from where did it carry it from? Was there another Sahara somewhere else that all of a sudden packed up and moved to a place of the current Sahara, she asks. Instead of wasting time with the so-called hypothesis, if we look at this photograph, what we see is a level surface of the earth, and then lots of sand dumped there, and even the level surface over which the vehicle is driving. Even that, we are not sure if it is natural origins, because don't forget, the burials of the rather tall blonde people were under 30 meters of earth. It is not normal to dig that much for a grave. It really looks like the entire Egyptian civilization was buried with layers of soil. She doesn't know if it was clay, like everywhere else, or what, and then sand on top. That seems to have been the standard procedure over the ages. For example, in Turkey, this is a very interesting site of Nimrod. The main structure is covered with piles of very industrial-looking gravel. Of course, the mainstream version is that primitive people dragged it in baskets and on donkeys and mules. But in this historian's fairy tale, they conveniently skipped over the point in telling us how the lords of the mules and donkeys produced all the gravel. It's a very uniform size. It's very clean. You can't just collect this out on the hills nearby. It has to be manufactured somehow. Also, Teotihuacan has a couple meters of clay. Massive amounts of clay would have been needed to cover the city. How did they do that? She asks. Another example of selectively burying historic sites under clay is the Great Pyramid of Tulula. It turned out that the mainstream stories of how it was buried were deliberate fraud, as shown in previous episodes. It is not that the dark Africans were just sitting around waiting for the gods to culture them. They were also actively travelling all over the world. The Olmecs from America were a very much an international mixture, as some of them are clearly African, she suggests. The proof of that is found with huge stone heads, with some reaching 3.5 meters tall. If the facial features are not enough, she suggests, you can see the braids of hair on the back of some of the heads, typical African braids, and also some older skeletons of the Olmecs show a clear connection with an African race, with some similarities in their writing systems. Here are a few more African faces from South and North America. In the first episode about the true history of America, we saw numerous depictions of African elephants found on the American continent. The connection between the languages and the inscriptions found in various locations in both South and North America are again proof of the international relations. The African Olmecs had interesting friends. Chinese Olmecs wearing the typical tattoo, face tattoo, which is one of the worldwide watermarks of the earlier waves of survivors, or in this case, to be more precise, people who received their culture from the survivors. The parallels are countless. These are comparisons between Chinese and Olmec hieroglyphics. Now we have successfully managed to wipe out the Aztecs, which makes it easy for the mainstream historians to tell us that they looked like native people, like Native Americans, but the photos show otherwise. Not necessarily all aspects were of African appearance, but certainly there were some amongst them as shown on this pre-Columbian mural. These are more African artifacts found all over South and North America. Double cliff dwellings from Malay in Africa. And these are cliff dwellings from North America belonging to the Anasazi tribe. They look the same as in Africa. Other African dwellings called Telem. Africa also has its castles in a style which is typically European. At least for those who listen only to mainstream historical sources, this resembles the Pantheon of Rome, but it's in the African city of Kilwa. An ancient traveller shares his first-hand witness accounts of the Tasmanian city of Kilauea. It belonged at the time to the Swahili people. He describes it as one of the most beautiful and well-constructed cities in the world. We've been led to believe that ancient Africans were simply people, while only we in Europe were building things like this. But this isn't Mogadishu, Somalia. This is Mogadishu, some 100 years ago, when people were still enjoying the culture left by the survivors. But after the people of Somalia accepted the new history and the new paradigm and the new advanced civilization, this is what happened to them. We don't know how many millions or even billions are pumped into that region, coming from funds designed to spread democracy, keeping peace. Another batch of shameless lies, she believes. She has heard from people who have been personally there that the situation with the so-called wild parrots have absolutely nothing to do with what we are being told by the mass media. The so-called wild pirates are enjoying the use of well-functioning, top modern communication systems connected to satellites, of course, because there is no official ground telecom communications. There are unseen forces that continue to help them destabilize the region. Africa was well connected to the world with modern, for its time, poets, and was minting its own coins. Coins that were used as far as Australia. At that time, the African people were respected as members of the worldwide culture and were travelling freely, not as slaves. This clearly African person lived on the shore of the Black Sea. As we saw in the previous episode, people from Africa wearing typical African skirts and accompanied by a live giraffe were even depicted on walls of an Indian temple. And on the other hand, Indian artifacts are found in Africa. Africa was not at all backwards. We've been lied to about it, and the reason for which they want us to believe that Africa was backwards is to convince the people of Africa to accept the new fraudulent loans from the Western banks. And once they fall into the trap, the land is owned by the foreign big corporations. The people are driven away, either killed or starved. Local criminals are placed in the prospective governments, all financed by the funds for spreading democracy, and whoever has been left alive by the wars, the simple people, the people at rock bottom, can fend for themselves in the garbage piles, she states. This piece of beautiful blue geopolymer, or in other words, man-made stone, is from Sierra Leone. Our laboratories today cannot even figure out how they coloured or even how they made the stone. This site is in Ghana and very much resembles the European so-called Gorgon structures. Look at this African ruler or king. She doesn't know who he is, the important person from the Benin. He looks European, she speculates, his colour, hat and outfit, everything in general. She continues to say the mainstream history is being quite unfair to the African continent, presenting them like semi-dressed people without any culture and living only in the mud huts, while the civilizations that we have is attributed only to the Europeans who supposedly came up with it. Or did they? Is it quite possible we inherited it from an older civilization? The colonists did not bring any culture to Africa. They only destroyed as much as they could. And whatever they could, and whatever they couldn't tear down, for that they hired corrupt historians who wrote down a new history for them, according to which all the old buildings remaining from the culture of the survivors were labelled as colonial. This doesn't look like a mud hut culture to her. These are from Sudan. This southern part of Africa is home to millions, yes, millions of stone circles. Some of them are simple artwork, she believes, while others are proper stone drawings. Some of them are quite impressive. Official archaeologists are not interested in them. They don't conduct any excavations on them, which of course is a sure sign that they will not fit their expectations. And indeed, these circles are somewhat old. Many of them don't have doors or windows. Apparently that means not too much to the official historians, as they continue referring to them as cattle compounds, built for all kinds of now extinct flying cattle, apparently. Let's visit the site that may look to us like the capital of all stone circles in the southern part of Africa. It's called Great Zimbabwe. And the original version of the history is shrouded in mystery, as nobody knows who built it, or when, or why. In mainstream history, if it's a mystery, or we don't know, usually that means that they don't want you to know who built it. The style of construction used in Great Zimbabwe is very similar to the one belonging to the Chachapoya people of Peru. This is Zimbabwe, the site of the Kame, and this is in Peru. Now the circles in Zimbabwe don't have much decoration, but this is the main one. This is in Zimbabwe, and whereas this is in Peru. The bird symbol is considered the emblem of the Great Zimbabwe site. It is definitely the main one over there. So what we have within the Chachapoya culture is the same bird, and even the same zigzag patterns. Who were the Chachapoya people, she asks. They were red-haired and belonged to a Caucasian race. That is clear from the mummies that are found in Peru. We don't have skeletons from people who built the Great Zimbabwe, but we have an interesting medieval painting. Maybe this interesting African tribe from Zimbabwe had something to do with archaeological ideas seen in Great Zimbabwe, or maybe even they built it, she claims. For mainstream history, this is unacceptable. Heresy. And that's why they labelled it a fanciful depiction. It's a typical approach that they do with all ancient maps and sketches and drawings that don't fit their ideas. If you want to get a real feel of how it is to live in these types of dwellings, you can visit an Italian village of Alberto Bello, where we have the very same style of architecture, but in better state of preservation. There are a couple of mind-blowing earthworks in Africa, and here she is going to show us one of them. It stretches across several countries: Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Angola. Not only the canals are exceptionally straight, but they also continue that way for hundreds of kilometers. Now this is just one single canal, she believes. It's half a kilometre wide. This is just huge. The straight lines are very straight and go on for over 400 kilometres, and she hasn't even marked them all. And these continue here as well. These are also canals, and they stretch much more hundreds of kilometres. Were these made by primitive people living in mud houses carrying the earth in baskets, she asks. She personally cannot believe it, because first of all, the amount of time invested. If someone started calculating, this would reach a dead end to start with. And second of all, if the work was engineered and carried out by simple people on ground level, it would have followed most likely the natural curves of the terrain, which it doesn't. The scale of the footing leaves the impression that it has been done from above. These are hills. Did they really dig by hand and dig out the hills and remove them? She doesn't believe this. The area covered by this particular system is at least some 1,000 kilometres in diameter. This is huge. You can fit a couple of European countries in that area. So what's the purpose of this enormous canal structure? At first, she thought it may have been used for irrigation, but later on she noticed one detail which changed her mind. She now believes it was most likely something else, because if you look here, we have another grid crossing the better visible grid at an angle. It's not very visible, but if you spend some time you will notice it. Basically, whatever machine possibly using streams of sound to clear all these systems sometimes did it in that direction and sometimes in this direction. So it looks like they are doing something with the area, clearing it up, levelling it possibly. But there could be many other possibilities. They could have been testing the earth below for something to mine. It is possible that this is some remnant of mining, or maybe it was a weapon. Or maybe they were simply archiving parts of the Earth for the future civilizations to come. Or maybe, because the Earth is an artificial creation as such anyway, she believes, maybe these patterns are left from the time when they were shaping the Earth. Like they grew a couple of mountains made of stone, and then maybe line an artist with clay. Let's make a valley here, or maybe in something entirely different. Or maybe an entirely different reason that we can't even imagine, because the full thing is beyond our scale of understanding. What kind of technology do we have nowadays that could make meters deep rows of ground for hundreds of kilometers in perfectly straight lines, she asks. Since vast areas of Africa are scarcely inhabited or practically uninhabited, there are well-preserved lifelines in Africa, like this grid, for example. These lines are not modern roads. This is one example. This line is actually a dam, and the next line to it, and this is some sort of farm and modern road next to that. Here, this is the line, she states. It's definitely not another road, because here's the usual road, and it goes through the terrain that doesn't allow cars. This is one of the many instances that proves, she believes, that these lines are not some sort of modern road. Here she points to a line that can be compared to actual modern roads. This is the modern road. This is servicing these power lines. And you can see the modern track is actually only one lane. You don't need more than that in the desert. It's much smaller and it's not straight. It follows the terrain, while the larger line has completely different characteristics. Another example that shows that these are not roads, again here the lines are crossing terrain that is not suitable for cars. And also the cars would use this official road. It's got a bridge. These are not definitely some sort of modern roads. Here is another example of these larger lines crossing terrain that is not suitable for cars. The lines, she suggests, are not made recently as roads. This is the road, it has a bridge and the cars can use it. This, however, cannot be used by cars, yet more proof that these lines are not modern roads. They use some sort of unusual crossings and angles out in the desert. What is the need of a crossing here? And it's not following the terrain, she points out. If it was a car or truck, it would be like this. There would be no need for these angles. And this is all over the desert, where there is nobody anyway. Yet another case showing that these lines have nothing to do with modern roads is this. First of all, this line goes through mountains here. That also gives us some hint that it isn't made by some sort of technology that is familiar to us, probably from above, she theorizes. Because if it was done on the ground level, this would be difficult to crawl up and navigate in a straight line. So not only does it go through the mountains, but it also crosses the road here. There is no crossing junction here. The cars are not using it, she adds. And by the way, all of these roads, or probably most of the roads in South Africa, are probably placed on the existing infrastructure on the top. Probably was a borderline itself, she states. Here on the other side, still, are the remains of the borderline. Now these are interesting. The lines here are very steep and not on hospitable terrain like a desert floor, but rather in the mountains. This is how the mountains look like, and still there are lines on the cliffs themselves, she states. Here they continue. This is impossible, she believes, for a cutter or a modern car to have done this. And yet the lines continue, which is more proof that they were made from above with some sort of technology. Not only are all the lines obviously not roads, but they are also not part of fences for cattle. Even though there is a lot of cattle in this area, in these semi-desert parts of Africa, you don't place cattle fences leading off cliffs or crossing highways, she believes. Also, for obvious reasons, in this area the farmers don't use permanent heavy fences, but they use this type of fence which doesn't leave a mark on the land as such, she states. Besides, the very thick lines are thicker than modern roads, she states. Even if somebody argues that you can see the fence itself, it doesn't make a line. But there's always a road next to it, made by the farmer who is servicing the cattle. Anybody can open Google Earth themselves and see all these dirt roads in the countryside. They're clearly visible. They look like a pair of tracks next to each other, and they do not look like the lifeline, she states. This is interesting, she states. This is huge. This has been measured at over 200 kilometers long. She noticed on a map it's just one of such formations. Here's another, she continues. This one's not so clear, and she wondered what these shapes resembling squares are. This is huge, she states. When she zoomed in, she noticed those same canal-like long lines. Do you see them on the right-hand side? Then she noticed this brown spot like burnt grass. This is of course huge. And by the way, there were similar spots she found when she was looking at a system of canals, which she showed us somewhat earlier in this video. Another hypothesis about these systems of canals are that they were actually some kind of clean-up after some nuclear or rather very destructive war in the past. They needed to repair the earth to make it suitable again for habitation for the future races. The brown burnt circle that appears on the left side of the screen could be a nuclear crater, or crater from some other weapon, and the keepers of the time were simply cleaning the area with leaving long scars. The canals are marks of whatever tool or technique they were using. Who knows, she states. This is just yet another hypothesis which has not been proven yet, and this image illustrates how the bigger canal systems are connected with relatively smaller lines. Not that we can understand much, but one thing is for sure, they are connected. There are interesting pieces of glass in the Sahara Desert. Similar glass sometimes has been a byproduct of modern nuclear tests. Is it possible that the glass is left over of some war that we don't even know about, she speculates. It's not that difficult to find out actually, she believes. Because we have plenty of craters, and somebody who has a dosimeter and is curious enough, they can check what the radiation levels are at some of the craters. Many of them are conveniently and suspiciously located right next to historic cities. This is Aksum in Ethiopia. Of course, there could be still some remains possessing higher radiation levels if the bombing was done fairly recently. Even the very abundance of such craters near cities of the recent history by itself raises questions. So were people always attracted to craters when they were building their cities? Or is it more likely that the craters appeared after the cities? In Serbia, people were curious enough. Many of them did their own homework and fieldwork and found higher radiation levels at a number of city craters, she believes. But she is not aware of any other radiation being checked at other craters around the world.